All right, hello, this is chapter 3. So it's a little bit of a teaching of chapter 3 and what it is I'm going to be expecting of you to do. So this is a little bit different. This one just really asks you to answer some questions, some reading questions, and then some what I call golden lines. So as you're reading, highlight anything that you think is really important to the story or uses rhetoric really well or connects with you or allows you to feel some emotion. So a golden line can be anything that you find central and important to the passage according to you. Okay, so the first part is about a new owner of the plantation. His name is Colonel Lloyd. And he has this beautiful garden at this place. And people would come from all over to see it because it was a gorgeous garden on the plantation. But it had really good fruit and people wanted to eat it. And so if they did, that was considered stealing. And so they would receive lashes for it. He also had this like splendid riding stable and his equipage, which means all of the equipment that he had to go with it. Even though it was smaller, it was just the same like high quality as a larger establishment. And his horses were the finest form and noblest blood. And there were 2 slaves, and this was the father and the son, and this was their only job, was to take care of this part of the establishment. And it was not easy because Colonel Lloyd was kind of obsessed with the management of his horses. And any inattention to it was unpardonable, and they would receive a severe punishment. And they didn't know when they were safe from that punishment, and they were frequently whipped even when they weren't deserving it. And he just had a different mood. So sometimes, even if they didn't do anything big, he would whip them severely. Or if they did do something that might have deserved a whipping, then he wouldn't. You just never knew. It was so inconsistent, and they were scared and on edge at all times. He would constantly complain about things. So the quote here, which is a lot of, it's parallelism, but it's also antithesis, which is like, he might not have been rubbed and cured or properly fed. His food was too wet or too dry. It was too soon or too late. He was too hot or too cold. He had too much hay or not enough grain, or too much grain and not enough hay. And so he continually complained and would find something wrong. So no matter how unjust it was, the slave could never answer, because it really didn't matter. Because first of all, you don't want to contradict. And second of all, you just basically had to stand and tremble and be accused. So he was extremely wealthy. And they described him as the wealth of Job, the riches of Job in the Bible. So that is an illusion, rhetorical strategy. And he was said to own 1,000 slaves. And some of them, he couldn't even keep track of them all. Like he couldn't keep track of who owned what and who his masters were that he had guarding them, and it got to be a bit much. So you could never say anything against him because that would get back to him, and then it did happen to someone once, and then he was sent away from his family and given a fate worse than death. So part of this, that end of the chapter talks about how slaves actually would compare themselves according to their masters. So even if their masters were cruel, if they had a certain master, they would brag about him and say he was the richest, or that the other, like Mr. Jepson, they said that Mr. Jepson was the smartest. And so anyway, the point being is that they would almost like parents say, like, my dad can beat your dad, and my dad's smarter than your dad. And even though the irony of it is, even though they were so horrible and in their treatment of the slaves, they still defended them. And it was almost like the greatness of their masters was a representative of who they were. So the last line says it was considered as being bad enough to be a slave, but to be a poor man's slave or a slave of someone who was not a good man was deemed a disgrace indeed. So you can see a little bit more of their plight from chapter 3. So now you are to go to the chapter 3 questions and finish reading and finish completing those. How did Colonel Lloyd keep the slave boys from taking his fruit? So he did something to stop them because it was such a temptation. Why was it particularly difficult to be the slaves in charge of his horses? What is ironic about Colonel Lloyd's treatment of his horses compared to the treatment of his slaves? What happened to the slave who told Colonel Lloyd the truth about his master? What is a maxim? And give an example of this. Maxim is a word, a direct word in this reading, and then it gives you an example of a maxim. Discuss the prejudice that exists among slaves from different plantations. What is the irony of this prejudice? And I just talked about that at the very end. And then again, don't forget to just copy and paste or write out golden lines that make a statement about life, something meaningful to you, something that taught you something, like a moral truth, gives you a greater understanding about something that you didn't know, talked about an allusion to something or any type of rhetoric that you found to be particularly illuminating. Maybe that was that allusion that I pointed out. So any golden lines that you think were important to the story for whatever reason, whether it was good rhetoric or it was just interesting or it taught you something, really is up to you, and you just copy and paste those and then you Dropbox this. So have a good day. Thanks.